Hello, and welcome to my talk on the beneficiary pays principle. Let me first describe what the beneficiary pays principle is. But the beneficiary pays principle is a principle according to which those who benefit from an injustice hold remedial duties towards the victim of that injustice, merely in virtue of the fact that they benefit from that injustice. So in the absence of moral responsibility or even causal responsibility, merely by benefiting from injustice, you hold remedial duty towards the victim of that injustice. A famous example is the following. Imagine that you're a successful lawyer and that you have had a successful law career, in partly because you attended a very prestigious law school, Harvard Law School, and you realize later in your life that the reason you got in Harvard Law School is due to the fact that your father bribed the administration to let you in. And you do some research and you figure out who the person was supposed to get in instead of you is, and this person gave up on law and didn't succeed as well as they would have if they had entered into Harvard Law School. So according to the BPP, in this kind of case, because you benefited from an injustice, you owe something to the person who didn't get in. What exactly, this is unclear and can be discussed, but you owe something to them. So there are a few supporters of the BPP, like Daniel Butt, Robert Godin, Christian Barry, and Gerard Overland. And there are plenty of application of the principle. So if you think about climate change, many of us in Western industrialized nations benefit innocently from the activities causing greenhouse gas emission of our ancestors, whereas many in the poorest country will be harmed by this pollution. So if you just focus on past pollution that our country produced, we benefit from this pollution, right? Putting aside the pollution that we currently cause, because obviously we are morally responsible for that. But if we focus on past pollution, we just benefit from it in a way that might ground remedial duty towards the victim of climate change. Another example are colonial injustice. Many of us currently living in ex-colonial countries benefit innocently from the past injustice committed by our ancestors. And many are still suffering the consequence of these injustices. So there have been a few attempts to justify normatively the beneficiary pays principle. One of them being, for example, the claim that the benefit constitute unjust enrichment. So that's a legal term. As such, it doesn't, it rides on a specific legal concept. Or that the BPP amounts to rectification within a Nausicaan framework, but not many people accept such a Nausicaan framework. Lastly, some people suggested the benefit is a form of free riding, but even Axel Gossery, who suggested that, thinks that it's only part of the explanation. But none of this justification has been widely endorsed or has been found to be convincing enough to be widely endorsed. So instead, most proponents of the BPP ground it on a direct intuition about specific cases. So I'm going to look at one promising justification for the BPP to see if there is something there. So Daniel Butt has argued that identifying an injustice as such conceptually entails that beneficiary owed remedial duty towards the victim of that injustice. So he endorsed CE, the claim that we make a conceptual error if we condemn an action as unjust, but are not willing to reverse or mitigate its effect on the ground that it has benefited us. So I have issue with that because I think that first, it assumed the truth of motivational internalism. To say that one is willing to reverse or mitigate the effects of an injustice is to make a claim about what we intend to do. But intending to do something doesn't necessarily follow from judging that we ought to do that thing. So I may judge that that eating meat is wrong, it doesn't follow that I will intend not to eat meat. There is a wide, many people are weak-willed and may not carry out what they think is the right thing to do. So, but that's easy to address because we can just revise the conceptual error claim. We could say that we make a conceptual error when we judge an action to be unjust, but do not judge that its effect ought to be reversed or mitigated on the ground that it has benefited us. But if there is a conceptual demand stemming from the judgment that an injustice has occurred, it stems from the injustice itself. It seems to me that when we make that claim, it's more likely to interpret it as stemming from the injustice, not from the fact that we benefit from an injustice. So yes, we can accept the claim that we make a conceptual error when we judge an action to be unjust, but do not judge that its effect ought to be reversed or mitigated by someone. But here there is no mention of benefiting from injustice because it's not necessary to make that claim. Provided that the injustice in question can be reversed, of course, or mitigated, and that reversing or mitigating the effect of this injustice would not prevent us from fulfilling another more important obligation. Another argument that is produced by Daniel Butt is the counterfactual world argument. And in response to Thompson's suggestion that we would prefer a world where both existed and where our ancestor had not acted unjustly, but argues that if we actually wish we were in a different kind of world and think that such a world would be more just than our current world, surely it follows that we should seek to make our world more similar to the counterfactual world in question. So Butt thinks that this would support endorsing the BPP. Well, I don't think that's the case, but because I'm thinking that the source of the reason of why we actually think that one counterfactual world is better than the other is the fact that a certain injustice is absent from it, not the fact that we benefit or don't benefit from that injustice. So I agree that if there is a counterfactual world that is better than the one we currently live in, it gives us a reason to do something to try to make our world more similar to that one. But the source of the reason is the fact that we don't, it's not the fact that we don't benefit from the injustice in question, but rather the fact that the injustice is absent. So if you consider two different counterfactual worlds, and in one there is no severe injustice, but many small injustices with many beneficiaries, and another in which there are severe and small injustice, but nobody benefits from it, I still think that we should prefer a counterfactual world. Why? Just because there are no severe injustice in that world. Whether or not they are beneficiaries of injustice matter much less, or maybe not at all even. You could even think that the fact that they are beneficiaries are a good thing. So let me now say something about why I think that, although I think Daniel Butt was not right in suggesting that we have this conceptual contradiction involved when we benefit from injustice, I think he was onto something when he drew an analogy with Yana Thompson's apology paradox, and when he suggested that there is some kind of contradiction, because I think there is a contradiction in attitude, and that this contradiction in attitude explains some of our intuition in case in which we benefit from injustice. So let me start by describing what Yana Thompson apology paradox is. Yana Thompson argues that basically we are sometimes in a position in which we want to regret terrible injustice in the past, but it's very difficult for us and possibly impossible even to regret those, because regretting those would imply regretting our very existence. So here I reproduce or paraphrase the paradox, focusing on regret rather than apology. So one, slavery is a terrible injustice that we ought to regret and apologize for. 2, if slavery hadn't occurred, history would have been radically different. 3, if history had been radically different, we would not have been born. And 4, we can't regret that slavery has occurred and thus apologize for it, because we can't regret to have been born. So there are some people who have argued that we could find a way out of this paradox. And they have suggested ways to overcome the contradiction. One of them being, maybe we could redescribe the event as either a horrific and just past institution, so slavery as a past unjust institution, or as the causal condition for our coming to existence. So we could separate these two different ways of describing the same event. But that's obviously not a solution, because one could always ask, what's your attitudes towards the entire chain of events? And then you can't just, describe them in different ways. There is just one chain of event. And you may not know what the right attitude would be in this case. There are different ways that have been suggested to overcome the contradiction, but I'd like here mostly to focus on the analogy with the beneficiary pays principle. So there's a similarity here, because when we benefit from injustice, we might be inclined to regret the occurrence of that injustice, and at the same time, we may be inclined to be glad that we have the benefits that we have. So to illustrate, consider Julia was invested some stocks in security scanning device, and then 9/11 happens, and after that, her stocks go up in value, right? So she makes a fortune out of 9/11, in other words. Obviously, there's a big difference between this case and the apology paradox case, because in the apology paradox, regretting our own existence is much more difficult than regretting financial benefits. But there is a similarity to the extent that we feel that contradiction in attitude. Why is it problematic? Well, first, there is this kind of lack of internal coherence. This may be a problem from the point of view of rationality or psychology. Second, it undermines the empathy towards the victim. So if you're glad about your financial benefits, you might lack, there might be justified ethical constraint on how you express your gladness and when. And 3, attitude come with disposition to act in certain ways. So if Julia is glad that that her stock went up, she's maybe prone to celebrate and spend her money on a family holiday. Whereas if she regrets that the horrors of 9/11, she may be prone to give the money to the relative of the victim. So what I want to suggest here is that if we think about benefiting from injustice as a particular case of contradiction in attitude, and if the experience of unease we have in this case are rooted in the experience of conflicting attitudes towards that injustice, then in the absence of a normative justification for the BBP, this might provide a deflationary account of it. Obviously, I haven't demonstrated here that there is no normative justification. I've mentioned a few that were not successful, but it's entirely possible that we will find a normative justification. In the absence of it, I suggest here that maybe some of our unease that are in case that involve benefiting from injustice are due to this conflict in attitude. Someone may say here, well, of course, we often have conflicting attitudes, but what matters in the end is the overall attitude one takes towards that thing. And the overall attitude may be unified, despite an apparent initial tension when considering different aspects of that thing. So when only financial benefits are at stake, obviously it's easier to regret. And we need to look at specific case of conflict in order to figure out which one, what we ought to do. But one, there may be cases in which it's clear that we ought to have an overall attitude of regret. Maybe the past injustice is so great and the benefits we have from it are just not worth it. So we may be kind of inclined to overall regret that kind of case. But we may also, there may also be cases in which the injustice is small and the benefits are so widespread that we may be inclined to not regret the injustice in question. What I want also to mention here and discuss a bit are cases in which there is a deep ambivalence, because I think the apology paradox is such a case. And I'm now going to turn to another one of these cases. And it's the Bourgeois Predicament as discussed by J. Wallace in The View from Here. So J. Wallace suggests the following, that in developed country, the activity that we most cherish, like spending quality time with our family, are only possible because of present and past injustices. So all the valuable aspects of our lives, such as meaningful work, philosophical research, for example, leisure time, are dependent on vast injustices. So J. Wallace argues our grand projects are the basis of our affirmative attitude towards the life that we lead. But a bourgeois character means that those projects implicate us in social and economic disparities that we cannot possibly endorse. And according to J. Wallace, escaping the predicament may not be feasible because too many facets of our life is conditioned by global injustice, and whatever will be left as leisure activity for ourselves will still be conditioned by it. So there is no way of escaping this. So maybe what we are left with here is that there may be something in just the fact of pointing the causal connection between the injustice and the benefits, because that may be enough to motivate beneficiary to give to the victim of injustice. Pointing to this causal connection might indicate that we are not entitled to our benefits, undermine at least our sense of entitlement to these benefits if we see that there is no strong connection between us and these benefits. And two, it may also lead us to be more psychologically inclined to strive to overcome the contradiction in attitude and disgorge the benefits in order to not experience this contradiction. So if Julia, for example, discards the benefits she received from her stocks, she will not experience a contradiction in attitude anymore. She will only be able to regret 9/11. So to conclude, our duties towards the victim of injustice are not grounded on our benefiting from injustice. Instead, they are grounded on, I believe, the fact that we can help, the fact that we are not entitled to what we have, and the consideration that they are victims of severe injustice. This is not something that I've argued here, but these seem to be more plausible grounds for our duties towards the victim of injustice than benefiting from injustice. I've suggested here a deflationary account of our intuition in favor of the BPP. The intuition behind the BPP might be accounted for by the fact that being the beneficiary of injustice often brings up conflicting attitudes, and that's why we feel a bit uneasy about them. In specific case of benefiting from injustice, the key question is whether there is overall reason for the beneficiary to adopt an overall attitude of regret towards the injustice in question. In case in which there is an overall attitude of regret or ambivalence remains, pointing out the causal connection between the beneficiary and the injustice might motivate the beneficiary, if they are minimally virtuous, to get rid of the benefit, so as to resolve the contradiction. So to that extent, this connection might be relevant to point out because they may be a helpful motivational tool. Thank you.